Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Hello, everyone. I am so happy to finally welcome you to the TEDx Portland State University 2020. Whether you're watching this from right here in PDX or from somewhere else in this marvelous world, I'd like to extend a ginormous thank you for watching tonight and for your commitment to hearing ideas worth spreading. Just like TED, we believe in the power of ideas to change attitudes and ultimately change the world. So without further ado, let's get on to the event. To introduce myself, my name is Cheyenne Dela Cruz, and I'm this year's lead organizer for TEDx Portland State University.
And I'm Sasheen Turner, co-lead organizer for TEDx Portland State University. We are also proud to present this year's talk in a whole new format on a new stage and stream our speakers' ideas worth spreading to wherever you are.
This year's theme is Our Time is Now. With the onset of COVID-19, social unrest upon the recognition of deeply rooted racial injustice throughout our world, and this year's elections, we felt it was more important than ever to start open dialogues within our community and engage in meaningful, respectful conversations. Before we head into our first set of speakers, I'd like to recognize the rockstar team of 22 volunteers for this year's event. We are all students and recent alumni of the PSU community, and we all came together for the first time this year to spark conversation and give voice to our community. Over the course of this first night, we have the privilege of bringing you 5 ideas worth spreading, delivered to you by the masterminds themselves. I'm proud to say that all of our speakers tonight are from the PSU community. We also have the privilege of connecting you with some of our local neighbors who reflect the community values we believe in. And we'll be hearing from an amazing local artist and musician who generously shared their music for tonight's event. Lastly, I'd like to give a huge thanks to our partners who provided us with the resources we needed to make this year's event possible. Thank you to Cairn Therapy, Fairy Tale Event Design, Kennedy Violins, and Vintage Meets Modern Events. Thank you to Portland Center Stage at the Armory for hosting us for this year's recordings, And a huge thank you to our title sponsor, Goldendale Capital, for believing in our vision, just as you did for the 2019 in-person event.
Here at TEDx Portland State University, we aim to amplify the voices of our community. Sadly, we are missing some category leaders that have been with us since the very beginning. We hope to see them around though, and we look forward to seeing them continue to be reliable pillars in our community. Tonight, our speakers will interpret what it means to be a connection builder and a pattern recreator in 2020. In between each category, we will hear a message from our neighbors who have been deeply impacted by the pandemic. Hold on tight till the end. We will be moderating and choosing some great questions to ask during the live discussion panel between all attendees and guest speakers via Zoom. And don't worry, we'll remind you when it's time. This being said, we highly encourage you to add your questions and your comments to the YouTube live chat feature. Feel free to engage. We'd love to see your watch party set up. Please use hashtag Portland State Our Time if you are posting on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn.
There's no doubt this year's event and vibe are very different. In response to the injustices we've seen throughout our communities, we wanted to highlight local BIPOC-owned businesses as this year's neighbors. Now, we all know neighbors are the foundation of community. However, not all neighbors start off in the same place to arrive here. TEDx Portland State University recognizes the challenges of our BIPOC neighbors, and this year, we wanted to invite them to tell their stories. To start us off, here is a message from Elevate, Oregon.
Elevate Oregon exists to impact the lives of underserved teens by providing consistent, long-term relationships with caring and qualified adults who empower students to envision and actualize unique paths to personal success, both in school and beyond. Our culturally responsive model utilizes diverse teacher mentors who integrate classroom teaching and holistic in-school support with strategic relationship building, inspiring confidence and a life-giving sense of agency in every student.
Without Elevate, I don't think I'd be going to college because I didn't have a lot of support in home or out.
It takes a village to raise a kid, and we're a part of that village. We can definitely put them in the right position to meet people, to give them more opportunities to succeed.
Elevate taught me if there's a problem, you have to be that change in order to have a change. So I want to be a police officer and protect citizens.
It's really important for us to instill a pride in who they are.
You know, you ever had those teachers when you were younger, the cool teachers that were really relatable, that really cared about you, and that just helped you outside of school? Well, every teacher mentor in the program are those teachers.
And just building relationships, you know, it's important for those kids not only to see us in the classroom, in the school setting, see us out, you know, in the community. And that's what it's about. Everybody's not the same. So that's why we got to come down and reach them where they're at so we can motivate them to be the best that they can be.
We do one-on-ones. We take them out to eat, sit down and you talk to them and just let them know how proud you are. Just letting them know, hey, you know, we appreciate you listening. We appreciate you giving us the opportunity to be in your life. At the end of that semester, you have a 3.0 or higher. You go on the big trip. We take kids out to a big place to do something.
I'm taking them to Prescott Elementary today, and we are running our Little Lift with first and second graders. The goal is for us to be able to mentor our kids to mentor other kids.
I think it puts them in a position to where they can kind of see what it's like on the other side. So I think it's great for them. I think it's positive reinforcement.
By helping these kids get on the right path for graduation, seeing what opportunities lie ahead, we can really help change their lives. But there's also a real economic benefit If these kids don't graduate, and we look at the statistics, what happens is there's a huge social and economic cost on our society.
We have the opportunity to teach kids the life skills they need to navigate the challenges. We have the opportunity to give kids the love they need in order to weather the realities. And we have the opportunity to give kids the hope that they need to focus and believe something better is ahead.
You just get more hands-on time. We get that hour where we can really formally teach them, and that is our biggest asset. That's totally different from any other mentoring program.
So I can choose to stay the same and be the same person, make the same mistakes, have the same views on life, or I can choose to evolve as a person, get better, make better decisions, learn from mistakes, grow from mistakes, right?
Our kids are gonna fail. Everyone fails in life. Our job is to be there when they do fall, because you have to get up. You have to get back up.
You have kids now that are exposed to so much and they lack in certain areas. It's easy for them to get caught up and make a bad decision outside of here to where they're involved with the authorities and they end up in a place where they can't come out of.
When you have a mentor that can come in and give me insight on what's going on with that kid, we can work as a team to get that kid the resources and advocate to the teacher involved to really help solve the issue behind the behavior.
If you haven't shared what you fear to those kids, or if you haven't expressed to them what you doubted and what you feared and how you overcame it, how are they going to?
Alondra is a kid who, she's got this vivacious personality and she'll talk, and you're like, no, I want to really know. She's one of those students that doesn't necessarily want to talk about it.
Tell me about what Mason means to you.
It's gonna make me cry. Kind of look at her like a big sister, because I'm the oldest in my family, and I always feel like I have a lot of pressure on me.
That's really where we're at with Alondra, is that breakthrough of just, you can do it. You can do it. Regardless if you think you can or not, I'm gonna show you can. I'm gonna prove to you that you can.
Your belief and investment plays an essential role in unleashing the potential of our youth as leaders and change makers of the future. Providing access to opportunity and positive guidance yields brighter futures, healthier families, and stronger communities. Elevate Oregon. Together, we can.
Thank you, Elevate Oregon. Your focus on empowerment and setting our future leaders up for success is encouraging, inspiring, and very much needed. Now into our first category, connection builders. Sometimes it's difficult to connect, and recently, many have found it even more challenging. Our upcoming speakers share their experience and knowledge in building connections. Coming up is a first-generation young Afro-Latino who created a podcast that is centered around honesty, transparency, and vulnerability, intending to open up conversations to their fullest. He describes himself as someone who deeply wants to help people connect through self-awareness. Please welcome our first speaker, Gio Tayeto.
Hello. My name is Bertaniti Giovanni Tayeto. You can call me Gio for short, but please don't call me short. And I know what you're thinking. Man, that's a pretty long name, and it is. It's about 26 characters, rarely fits in applications. I know what you're probably wondering as well. That's an Italian name. Is this guy Italian? He doesn't look like it. Where's the accent? And no, I'm not Italian. I'm actually Haitian and Mexican. But I know what you're probably thinking at this point, and that's, what am I getting myself into? This guy seems to be really into his own name. Well, the thing is about a name is that there's always stories behind it, and I love stories. See, the stories behind people's names are what makes us up as a person. It's what makes us unique, different, and for some people, it even defines them. So in a way, you can say that the names are the cover to our stories. And you know how the saying goes, don't judge a book by its cover. We all know how it feels, though, to be judged or to judge, because we all have our biases, our life experiences, education, and many other things that help form our perception or interpretation of things. So when you're judging someone, you're allowing your perception or interpretation to tell that person's stories versus just understanding them and accepting them first. See, that's the thing. Judging has always been easy, but accepting someone is pretty hard. I'd like to tell you a story behind my name, right? And that story starts with the fact that I am a Mexican and Haitian man. I am the first generation son of two immigrants by the names of Antonia Guterres from Mexico and Flatinaz Joseph from Haiti. As you can tell, I don't really share the same last name as my parents. And the reason behind that is because of my dad. He wasn't much of a rule follower. And in the time that he was growing up in Haiti was around the same time that they had a heavy military dictatorship. So, when it came to the point where he had to be drafted into the army, it didn't take much time till he ended up in jail. After 2 years of being in jail, he was released and he quickly joined the rebellion. Like I said, my father wasn't much of a rule follower. So let's just say he was a pretty great rebel. And it was so great that it got to the point that he was either going to be executed on the island or he was going to end up in America. He chose America, just like many other people do. But he also chose to steal a man's identity. And thus, Joe Tayeto was born, and many years later, Bertaniti Giovanni Tayeto was too. Crazy story, right? I know. But that's just one story of many that makes up who I am as a person. See, the stories behind our names are what makes us so unique, right? And that's why I love a good story, because it's there to break the ice. It's there to help us connect. Most importantly, the stories behind our names are there to humanize things and build curiosity and even build some kind of form of understanding. But unfortunately, nowadays, people don't tell their whole stories. Some people don't even know their own stories because they don't take the time to get to know themselves. And in some cases as well, people don't know how to share their stories because we were never taught how to communicate those things. I used to be one of those people. I love to talk. But at some point in my life, I started to build this big wall, bigger than the one that they have over there in China. So big that I added a front because I wanted people to feel more comfortable about my stories. I used to tell myself that if I could just get somebody to like me, everything would be okay. But what I didn't realize is by not being true to myself and by not being able to share my own stories, I wasn't allowing people to accept me. I wasn't allowing people in. See, you know how the other saying goes, right? The loudest person in the room tends to be the saddest. Well, I was pretty loud. So that sadness led to my inner battle with chronic loneliness. And that loneliness led to years of negative mental behavior, mental isolation, and just overall not feeling accepted by people. And I know what you're wondering or thinking at this point. This guy, alone, lonely? I mean, he has a cool name, he's giving a TED Talk. He can't be or feel that way. But see, that's the problem right there. We all just judge people. We don't give each other enough grace and realize that people can lie to themselves or lie to others about their stories. But what we can no longer do is lie about the fact that we cannot be alone. Okay? Alone time can be a good time. But when I say that we can't, I mean that we can't. In my battle with loneliness, I learned that loneliness can lead to serious health issues. Things like depression, things like anxiety, things like heart disease. And in some studies, they have found that it could increase your chances of death. That's weird, right? Loneliness. We were all taught that it was just an emotion. But in reality, it's actually a physiological experience that we have in our bodies. The best way to think about it is when it's time to eat, our body tells us that we're hungry. So when you're alone, your body makes you feel lonely because it's telling you to be around people, that you're safer with people. So now, in a time of civil unrest, in a time where we're more connected online than we are with people in front of us, in a time where loneliness has become a disease that literally takes years off of your life and it's spreading across the nation, in a time where the color of my skin is still enough of a difference for somebody not to accept me, we have to learn to accept the stories. We have to learn to hear the stories, and most importantly, we have to learn to share the stories. See, now more than ever, we have to become connection builders. And like any builder, you have to have your tools, right? Things like honesty that help build trust, transparency that lets people see your honest self, and vulnerability that invites the people to see who you are as a person. Like I said before, judging is really easy, but accepting someone is very, very hard. It's hard because if we don't learn to accept our own stories, we'll never be able to accept somebody else's. And I'm a person that likes to make things easy, right? So here's an equation for you, and I hope that you write this down. Honesty plus transparency plus vulnerability equals accepting the differences between each other. The key to that equation is vulnerability, because it's the hardest part. See, I can be honest because I'm up here being honest with you, and that's pretty easy. Transparency is a little bit more complicated because it takes courage to really put yourself in front of people. But vulnerability is hard because it takes effort. It takes conviction. Like I said, the best kind of stories are stories told. But my favorite kind of stories are stories that connect people. Stories that connect people apply those three things. So, a story that helps connect is an honest story. Honesty is nothing but a moral character of attributes such as straightforwardness, truthfulness, and integrity. All those things combined allow this honest story to build that trust. A story that helps connect is transparent. Transparency is something that is fine and sheer enough to see through. So when a story is transparent, it is allowing you to see through the storyteller. When a story that is there to connect, it is also vulnerable. Vulnerability is defined as someone that is capable of being physically or emotionally wounded. And the key word there is capable. See, it is an action that takes effort. It's easy, again, to be honest. I'm up here being honest with you. It's a little bit harder to be transparent, again, because it takes a lot of courage, right? And vulnerability is the hardest because it takes conviction, it takes that effort. But I'm a firm believer that you can't ask people to do anything without being able to do it yourself. So I can't sit here and ask you to be more honest and transparent and vulnerable and apply it to your daily life just so you can accept everybody if I'm not willing to do it with you. So I'm here, I'm honest, I'm transparent because you can see me, but now it's time for me to be vulnerable with you. I want to share another story, and this story is where my loneliness began. It's still a hard story for me because it's a story where I wish I would have been more honest and transparent and vulnerable with this person that I went through this with. See, one day during the summer going into my senior year, my mom slipped and fell and hit her head while doing her favorite thing, which was cleaning. As she was taken to the hospital to get and receive stitches and a checkup for her head, they ended up finding a small tumor in her brain. At the time, they told us that that tumor was benign, but honestly, I felt like it wasn't something that was going to go well. But I lied to myself and I lied to my mother and told her everything was going to be fine. Fast forward more time, and now it's a couple of months. It's been a couple of months, and my mom suffered from a serious stroke, a stroke that allowed her body to lose mobility completely from her left side. So we had to rush her to the hospital for emergency brain surgery. I woke up the next day, it's 5 a.m., and I'm in the hospital lobby. And this is where the story really begins, because this is a point in my life where I felt a true sense of honesty. As I was walking up to my mom's room, so was the doctor. The doctor looks at me and asks me, "Are you the son of Antonia?" And without hesitation, I say yes. He looks at me and he says, "I'm sorry, but your mother has a rare form of brain cancer that isn't treatable. We believe that she only has 3 to 6 months to live, and we're not really sure if she's ever going to walk or talk the same way." He looked me in my eyes again and he says that he's very, very sorry. I thought he was supposed to go into the room, but probably in that moment he switched his mind and he walked the other way. In that moment, though, I knew that he was being honest with me. So I trusted the words that came from him. And when I went into the room, I looked into my mother's eyes and she knew what was going on and I knew what was going on. Fast forward even more time. My mom hits a 1-year mark, doubling the time that they said that she would actually have, but that was the thing. It was borrowed time, and we both knew it. So in our weekly morning walks, I noticed tears coming down my mother's face. And before I could even ask her what was wrong, my mom looked at me and said that she's scared to die. She wasn't scared for me, she wasn't scared for my brother, she wasn't scared for my family, but she was ultimately scared just to be gone. So we just sat down and we talked about it, we cried about it, and we laughed about it. And at some point, we just got real about life. At some point, we got vulnerable with each other. And honestly, that's something we never really used to do. But after that day, there wasn't anything my mom didn't know about me. And after that day, I got to hear the stories behind the name of Antonia Guterres. October 30th, 2015, my mother passed. But after that experience, I learned that in life, those 3 things, honesty, transparency, and vulnerability, can help you connect deeply with yourself and the people around you. But like I said before, I did the opposite. I built up this wall. I built up this front. I decided I wasn't going to share my stories, and I decided that I wasn't going to be real with people. That began the slippery slope that was my reality, which was loneliness. But after some time, I decided that I was going to be honest again. And I started with being honest with myself. I reflected on the fact that I lost my father at 11 to suicide. And I didn't want to end up that way. I didn't want to feel those feelings anymore, and I didn't want to be that person. So I decided that I was going to be transparent and see within myself to find the conviction to be more open with others, to be more vulnerable. And over time, it turned into a podcast. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, a podcast just like everybody else, right? But my podcast was about having those honest and transparent and vulnerable conversations around all sorts of kind of topics with all kinds of different people. See, like I said before, vulnerability takes effort. And unknowingly, that podcast became my effort. I found the value again in having those honest and transparent and vulnerable conversations with ourselves or with others. And no, you don't need to have a microphone in front of you to sit down and talk about relationships or love or death or whatever it may be. But what you do need to have is the conviction to be open and honest and let people in. See, now it's our time, as we can see in 2020, that we have to be able to put our differences aside and accept each other. In a time where it's your turn to start sharing the stories behind your name, which I hope you do before life teaches you the hard way as it did for me. Because honestly, there isn't a day that I don't wish I would have been more honest and transparent and vulnerable with my mom. But I don't have that opportunity now. So I challenge you. I challenge you to be honest with yourself. I challenge you to be transparent with the people around you and the people that love you. And most importantly, I challenge you to be vulnerable so you can accept that love and they can accept yours. Because in 2020, of all years, we can see that life can be short. We can see that life can be pretty damn hard. But life is so much better when we just accept each other. So, to close off, I want to say thank you for allowing me to be honest with you, to be transparent in front of you so you can see who I am, and most importantly, to be vulnerable with you so you can accept the person that I am. Thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I love you. This was a real talk. Have a good one.
Thank you so much, Gio, for your vulnerability and openness. Our next speaker is a single mother of 18 years and an educator for 30. Though it takes a village to raise most children, 2 countries helped raise her son. It's been her mission to best raise and educate bilingual, bicultural children. And she's thrilled to share what she's learned from experience. Please welcome our next speaker, Yoko Kinoshita Gorman.
It takes a village to raise a child. It is from an African proverb. In my case, it took 2 countries to raise my son. I'm a single mother for 18 years, a mentor for 3 years, and a teacher for 30 years, and a college student for 15 years. I'm here to share a story about my life project, raising my son internationally, and how a wonderful collaborative project can occur in daily life. My son was born and raised in Kobe, Japan. Thankfully, my white American ex-husband accepted his job in Japan for our son to be born there because we lost our first son in the US. We moved from the US to Japan for our second son. My son and my leap of faith journey started from his one statement in Portland. ママ、僕はアメリカ人だよね。アメリカで勉強する権利があるよね。ホームレスになってもアメリカで勉強する権利があるよね。Mom, I'm an American citizen. I have my right to study in the US. Even if I become homeless, I have a right to study in the US, correct? It was what my son said to me when he was 9 years old, when I took him to my international teachers conference at Portland State University. In my mind, did he just say he wants to study? He was avoiding any of his studies, including English. I encouraged my son to interact with English-speaking children. For that reason, I took him to the only one full English service Catholic church in Kobe, Japan, almost every Sunday. It took us more than an hour each way to get there by walk, bus, and train. It was the only place I could think about, except international private schools where I tried to get a job so I could afford his tuition. Because my son is mixed race, he does not look totally Japanese like me. Once the US immigration officer at the airport asked me, "Where did you meet him?" That was a surprise question for me. In my mind, okay, I guess he has been with me since I was pregnant. How can I answer this question? What does this question really mean? It was a good question, which I have never thought about. I answered to the officer, "This is my son. He came from me," thinking, how can I prove he's my son? Another time, when we were stopped by an US immigration officer, the air between the officer and me became tense. So my son started crying. The officer told me that it was my fault. A fault. I was coming to the US from Japan legally, and I was trying to come to the US for my son's education because he is an American citizen and thinking of his future. He was doing his job, and I was doing my job as a mother. I told my son quietly, "Please remember this moment so you can figure out how to make this system better as a bridge between the US and Japan in the future. They are just doing their job." I wanted my son to feel his belonging to both of countries because he felt outsider from both. Another officer kept telling this officer, "Look her attitude, and she does not do anything wrong." He was trying to let us go. Japan is a relatively homogeneous country. My son and only one more student were different color in his school, which had about 700 students. Just imagine 698 students totally look Asian. Only 2 students are mixed with white, a different color. One time when I went to pick him up at the park at dusk, he told me, "ママは僕がどんな思いをしているかわからんよね." Mom, you don't know what I've been through. I was stunned. I thought about how he had been feeling isolated from others in Japan. I am in the majority in Japan, equivalent of white person in the US. My son is noticeably a minority due to his appearance in Japan, but of course, he was born and raised in Japan, so his inside is totally Japanese. It is funny that his whiteness from his face stands out in Japan. In the US, his Asian side from his face stands out. He is opposite from a chameleon. People in Japan talk to him in English even though he only spoke Japanese. People admired his Japanese, which is his mother tongue. Education is my specialty. I went to a graduate school in Japan while teaching English to research how to educate my son and student to be bilingual and bicultural. 10 years old is a key stage for language learning. So, when my son declared his strong will to study English in the US, which opened a huge new door for him. A strong motivation is a key for any learning. I told him, そうやね。母さんに何ができるか考えさせて。Well, let me think how I can help you. My son became a leader for my life and a follower in my adventure for him. My father encouraged us to find a place for us to live comfortably because he saw our struggles in Japan. However, it was not easy ride. Shortly after we moved to the US, my son cried saying, "Mama, 僕がここに来たいって言ったからここに来たんだよね." Mom, I said I wanted to come here. That is why we are here, right? Of course, it was a big challenge for him to adapt a new life in the US without knowing much English. I replied, そう、もう戻れないよ。やり通さないと。Yes, my son. We cannot go back now. We want to make it. Then it was just amazing to see how much he started talking English, being in the US only for 3 months, even though his academic struggle lasted almost 5 years since then. 我以外皆しなり. Everybody is a teacher for me. Through this adventure, I learned that I do not know what I do not know. To know what I do not know, I need to be a student to everybody, including my own baby. 18 years ago, when I was cleaning a room, and I was thinking aloud to give up my dream to go to graduate school. My son was 2 years old at that time. He overheard me saying this and told me, ママ、でもそれがママのやりたかったことなんでしょ? Mom, that is what you want to do, right? His words spoke to me deeply. Without his words, I'm not here. We are all collaborators, each other. We do not know who and what will teach us when and how. Even before my child was born, my mother and I always talked about what the best way to educate my mixed-race child. Elementary schooling should be in Japan, and the rest of the education should be in the US. Japanese elementary schools are good for discipline and learning Japanese, which is called to be a hard language to learn. And American schools are better to nurture special talents. This plan was programmed in me so strong that it kept me going, even after her death and my divorce when my son was 2 years old. Our family, friends, teachers, mentors, co-workers, the Catholic Church, Lake Oswego Mayor Mr. and Mrs. Studebaker's family, even strangers on the street and grocery stores have been supporting our journey. I have never expected this challenging, exciting, and blessed journey with my son. It is a miracle for me to see my son now in college in the US. This journey is a good example of an internationally collaborated project. In this individualistic society, we might ask ourselves, why do we need to collaborate? What makes us excited about collaboration? How can we create our own family and community bonding with feeling love and building trust? What collaboration can we perform with others through our jobs and daily lives? Respect each other, be beneficial in our community, and create community to be thrive, interdependent, and collaborative. I hope my son and I can be beneficial for this society. It is time for us to return the favor to our community, which has been nurturing us. And after all, I think we work simply to enjoy meals together with our favorite people. For that reason, we like to work together to build wealth in many ways, understand, respect, and care for each other, building a relationship in a loving way and building trust. So we can be beneficial for our society, which nurtures us. My son told me with his relaxed voice a couple of years after living in the US, ママ、今まで僕両方の国でのけ者だったけど、今は両方の国が自分の国になった。両方の国に友達がいる。Mom, I felt I was outsider from both countries before. Now I feel belonging to both countries. I have many friends in both countries. This comment made me feel deeply thankful. It's worth effort to come to the US. I think it is time for us to create win-win-win situation by taking actions collaboratively, beyond categorizing people based on gender, race, age, disability, or socioeconomic status. So we can benefit from any ability from many kinds of people to create something new. Thankfully, my son and I are enjoying creating community through having suppers with many kinds of family and friends from many countries. Currently, my son is 20 years old. It took a huge village, combined 2 countries, to raise him, and he raised me. I thank all our supporters in both countries. Now, I hope all of us here can see together how such an awesome international project can occur collaboratively in our daily life. Fortunately, my sons become totally bilingual or bicultural. My son asked me in English fluently after his high school graduation. So, now, what do you want to do, Mom? Currently, I am a mentor at Portland State University. This is my ideal job at this point. While my son achieves his dream job, he helps me to achieve my dream job. I dedicate this speech to honor our supporters, especially my parents in heaven. ありがとう、父さん、母さん。Thank you, Father and Mother. And I would like to say thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Yoko, for sharing your wisdom and inspiration. This next talk will highlight economic justice, environmental, and women movements in Iran in the contemporary period, and connect them to movements oriented around a similar theme in the United States. Please welcome our next speaker, Robert Asadi.
When our narratives of others become polarized, they often obscure more than they reveal. It's no secret that we live in a time of increasing political tension and political polarization, whether that's in our domestic politics across the lines of political ideology, or in international relations across borders and different political systems. Our narratives of others in this context have become increasingly broad and reductive, inside and outside, us and them, our values and vision for the future and theirs. Imagine asking Da Vinci to paint the Mona Lisa using only a paint roller. And yet this is how we approach constructing our narratives of others, particularly those who appear most different from ourselves. I want to suggest today that one way we can push back against this narrative polarization is to shift our gaze from the level of governments to the level of the people and society. How are ordinary people engaging in activism to try to transform their world? In my own research, I study Iranian politics. I look at narratives of Iran from the outside. When I talk to my students about this and I ask them, what narratives do you have about Iran? They often tell me stories about Iran as a threat, or Iran as hostile and antagonistic, Iran as a part of the axis of evil, and so on. This negative perception is also reflected in polling data. Gallup, for example, polls Americans and asks them to give their favorability rating of select numbers of countries, Iran being one of them. And consistently, since the late 1980s until today, about 4 in 5 Americans respond that they have an unfavorable view of Iran. This is puzzling to me, not only as someone who studies Iran, but as someone who has a personal connection to this culture. I'm Iranian American. My father immigrated to the United States in the 1970s. My mother is an American born in the United States. And so I grew up between these two cultures, the United States and Iran. And the narratives I saw in the media and later in the academic and policy literatures about Iran stood starkly at odds with my own experiences with Iranian people. And I began to wonder what could be gained if we put away the paint roller and took out a more nuanced brush, so to speak, to our understanding of Iran. I want to tell you about 3 social movements in Iran, movements for environmental protection, for gender equality, and for economic justice, which all demonstrate that Iranians, like Americans, and indeed like the international community, are facing many of the same challenges and have very similar aspirations for what they would like a future society to look like. Before I move on to tell you about these 3 movements, I want to share with you a personal story that got me thinking about the differences in government narratives versus the narratives of people. So imagine the scene. It's a hot summer afternoon in June 2013. I'm in Tehran, the capital of Iran, and I'm heading to a restaurant. My relatives assure me that I have to try this specific dish called kalapache, which means head and feet. They say this dish is going to help cure my jet lag and give me a lot of energy. The dish is made from boiled sheep's head, eyes and tongue and brain included, and boiled sheep's feet, and then some combination of vegetables. As someone who's not a particularly adventurous eater, I thought this was going to be the most interesting thing to happen to me on that day. We went to the restaurant, and I remember the front facade of the building was floor-to-ceiling glass, so you could see right out onto the street. It was a narrow restaurant with a long counter behind which there was many boiling pots emitting a lot of steam and all kinds of aromas that were unfamiliar to me. So my cousin and family friend and I sat down and we had our meal, and I actually really enjoyed this new dish. As we finished up our meal, I looked out the front of the store, the front of the restaurant, and noticed more and more people filling the street. Far more people than should have been there on a typical Saturday afternoon. Then I glanced up to the television in the corner of the room and saw a government official standing behind a podium. And we realized he was announcing the election results. The presidential election had just taken place the day prior, and the results were in. The more moderate candidate favored by reformists in Iranian society, named Hassan Rouhani, had just narrowly crossed the 50% threshold he needed to win the election outright and prevent a runoff. In fact, he had 50.7% of the popular vote. And what we were observing in the street was people coming out spontaneously to demonstrate and celebrate this election result. It was not only a partisan victory, but a collective exhale, in a sense. The country was pivoting from a more inward-looking worldview and a more hostile relationship with the outside world under the previous president, more conservative, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And there was a lot of hope that the country was changing and would develop a more normal relationship with the outside world. We joined the crowd, and I saw things that I'll never forget that day. I saw cab drivers standing outside of their cars, stuck in a large crowd of people. They couldn't move, honking the horns, not out of frustration, but out of joy to be part of that scene. Shopkeepers coming out of their stores, offering trays of tea and other sweets and goodies to the crowd, and listening to the people chanting about change and about their hopes for the future. I thought, where have I seen such a crowd before? And what came to mind was 2008 in the United States, after the presidential election of President Obama. We saw similar crowds. I was a college student at that time, and I remember in the city where I was located, a similar spontaneous demonstration in response to the election result. So what I learned was, if we can shift our level of analysis from governments and official government narrative, and instead look at what's going on among everyday people, what's going on at the level of society, what I saw on the street in June in Tehran that day in 2013, how much more could we gain in terms of the sophistication of our understanding of others? I want to shift now and tell you about 3 social movements that emerged during Rouhani's presidency, which is now currently coming to an end in its final year. There'll be another election in Iran in summer 2021, but that's a story for a different day. The 3 movements I want to talk about all challenge our existing narratives of Iran and all provide lessons for our own activism here in the United States and elsewhere. The first movement I want to speak with you about is the environmental movement. And in particular, I want to tell you about a group called Nature Cleaners. This group started as a result of a Facebook post. A man named Kazem Najarian, who's affectionately known as Uncle Kazem, took a trip to a lake in northern Iran in 2012 and was so appalled by the trash and debris and litter that he saw in this natural setting, he made a Facebook post about it, decrying the environmental degradation that he observed. The post, as I said, quickly went viral, and people began to say, let's do something to address this. Let's not wait for government to respond. Let's take matters into our own hands. And so the group Nature Cleaners was formed. And here you can see an image from one of their cleanup actions. You can see people of all ages, all genders participating in the group, which is very inclusive. And essentially what they do is go out to some public space in a day or in an afternoon and clean up the litter. You can see their slogan in that image, less litter, live better. I found this such an interesting case and something that's so under-publicized outside of Iran, showing us the shared challenge to protect the environment. Just like we have movements for environmental protection here in the United States, so too is this happening in Iranian society. Folks who have been interviewed with Nature Cleaners report that their activism makes them feel more trust and makes them feel a greater sense of self-efficacy, that their action matters and that they're working to produce meaningful change in their society. So I think looking at Iran in this new way, we learn an important lesson, and that is that small actions matter. And it's important for us to take direct action in response to a challenge we perceive. The second movement in Iran I want to speak with you about is the movement for women's rights. This movement has a very long tradition in Iranian history from the pre-revolutionary period, indeed in the revolution itself, in which women participated in large numbers, and in the post-revolutionary era as well. By the 1990s, women were actively participating in the labor force in Iran. By the early 2000s, women outnumbered men in institutions of higher education, and women have consistently sought elected office at local and national levels in all branches of Iran's government. It's true that many of their candidacies have been blocked by a body called the Guardian Council, one of which functions is to vet candidates for elected office. But this has not deterred women from engaging in political action. If institutional channels have been closed, they've shifted to social action outside of the institutions of government. One example I want to share with you today is a movement called the White Wednesdays campaign. This was started in 2017 by an Iranian journalist and activist named Masih Alinejad. The White Wednesdays campaign encourages women to wear white clothing, particularly white headscarves, on Wednesdays to demonstrate their opposition to mandatory Islamic veiling in public, which has been a law in Iran since the revolution. So as you can see in this image, women are wearing white clothing, sharing those images on social media to raise awareness about this call for reform in the direction of greater gender equality. So what the White Wednesdays campaign shows us is that we must be persistent in our social activism. And if one avenue is blocked, we need to pursue others that are available. In the next slide, you can see this is a picture of women attending an Iranian men's soccer match from October 2019. This is the first time that they were able to attend a men's sporting event in over 40 years since the Islamic Revolution. And through the campaigns of White Wednesdays and My Stealthy Freedom, this issue of gender equality has risen more in the national consciousness and has in fact already started to produce change. So now women can attend men's sporting events and are more visible in public life in that way. The third and final movement I want to share with you today, and again, all of these challenge our simplistic, broad narratives of Iran from the outside. That third movement is the movement for economic justice. This really got off the ground in late 2017 and persists all the way into 2020. Iranians were responding to increasing economic hardships, particularly high inflation, which as of September 2020, inflation in Iran is now at historic highs. Also high unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, and perceptions of government corruption. In this first image from June 2018, you see protesters gathered outside of the National Bank of Iran, demanding reform and demanding greater accountability from government and from financial institutions for the economic hardship experienced by everyday people. These protests accelerated in late 2019 in response to a threefold increase in fuel prices, which raised the price of many basic commodity items. You can see here another image of protesters blocking a busy street and then being dispersed by riot police using tear gas. This movement for economic justice in particular, I think, really reveals the shared struggles that Iranians, like Americans, and indeed like many in the international community, are facing to create economic systems with more equity and more opportunity for working class people. The lesson from this case, I think, is to demand accountability from government officials. It's not enough only for our social action to be oriented toward consciousness raising, but also it has to speak to those in positions of power and those who can affect meaningful political change. All three of these movements complicate and unsettle the overly simplified narratives we might have of Iran from the outside. As I conclude, I want to encourage you to think back to the 2013 post-election scene that I described to you, that I got swept up in on that hot afternoon in Tehran in June 2013. This case, alongside the description of the three social movements I've given, all encourage us to shift our narratives of others from the level of governments to the level of the people. In doing this, we challenge the overly simplistic, reductive narratives of others. And I argue that if we see others more fully, more complexly, in the fullness of their struggles, we become more aware of both our shared aspirations for change, whether that be concerning sustainability in the environment, political rights and gender equality, or economic justice. And we also stand to learn something more about ourselves and lessons for our own activism along the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert, for your advocacy and your research. Our last connection builder of the night recognizes how easy it is to feel like we're mourning our old lives in a post-COVID world. She's put that feeling under a microscope, and she's got a way to work through COVID uncertainty like grief. Please welcome our last speaker of Connection Builders, Naya Mbach.
Hello. It's so wonderful to be here speaking with all of you, and it feels symbolic that I'm talking to an empty auditorium. It's another reminder of the state of our world. We're all going through something historic and unprecedented in our time. And we've all had varied experiences during this crisis, but the umbrella theme is still the same. You and I are living through a pandemic. None of us have been taught how to deal with these kinds of circumstances. The months trickle by, but the thought that haunts us all stays the same. When is it going to end? When can I pick up where I left off? It's difficult to talk about COVID-19 and the impact it's had on every facet of life while remaining positive. How do we talk about something debilitating with a sense of hope? How do we remain engaged in living our lives and working towards our goals in the face of such an uncertain future? The last 6 months have been really tough for me. Being a college student has been a huge part of my identity. I started taking collegiate level courses in high school when I was 14 and began community college at 15 years old. I missed out on a lot of those classic adolescent experiences and forwent a lot of living in the now so that I could pursue my future. I had a lot of aspirations, goals, and plans I was striving toward, and had just taken my first steps towards a future I was excited about. I had decided to apply to my dream graduate program, so I was getting involved in student leadership opportunities, touring grad schools, going to conferences, and working hard to build up my academic portfolio. When quarantine started, lockdown seemed like a brief inconvenience to wait out. But as the weeks dragged on, I realized that my enthusiasm for my plans started floundering. All the events I had were canceled. I felt like I was having to drag myself through my classes. I wasn't researching or learning. I wasn't myself. I felt sad, and it took me a while to recognize and call that sadness what it was: grief. When I think about grief and how it's expressed, I think about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model of grief, commonly referred to as the 5 stages of grief. It's a framework philosophy that can help give people a better understanding of their emotions around loss. The 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And it was amazing to realize that because of this pandemic, I had been experiencing the stages for myself. First, there was my denial. When school first shut down, we all thought it would be temporary. The constant message was that this would be short-lived and that it wouldn't have a major impact on anything, right? See, that's a huge part of the denial. This isn't happening. And by this, I mean a major disruption to all plans for the foreseeable future. Keep hoping that your graduation will be in person, and that concert you bought tickets for in 2 months should still be performing. Besides, the virus will disappear when the weather warms up, won't it? It was a time of bated breath and buckling down, and this felt like most of spring term for me and a lot of my colleagues. The thought was, if we could push through this one virtual term, we could get back to a sense of normalcy. But we all know, being that spring term was several months ago, that hasn't been the case. Then came the anger. What? Hold on. Summer is going to be virtual too. We just got through the gut punch that was spring. Now summer. Now fall. This is no longer anything resembling brief. I was angry that I was supposed to live this way. Zoom calls were awkward and glitchy all of spring term, but I let it slide because I thought there was a finite amount of time I'd have to deal with them. When the realization came that there was no clear end in sight, I felt tricked, like a rug had been yanked out from under me. This is also the stage of grief where I started to feel alone. There had been a lot of camaraderie in denial. We were all hoping for the best together, but anger was lonely. Am I the only one upset by this? How are people moving on? None of this feels right. After that was bargaining. I'd lost so much time at this point. Months have passed by, and I felt like I would only keep losing more. I was what-ifing myself sick. What if everyone I know has already adapted and found ways to thrive right now, and I'm the only one who hasn't? If I can just power through summer the same way I powered through spring, everything would be fine. Bargaining was my stage of false hope. I thought I could avoid the grief by negotiating with myself. It was a difficult stage to get through because it brought me a sense of false productivity. But it wasn't real. I was still just trying to get back to the person I was before the pandemic, still chasing after my old notions of normalcy. That reality isn't present anymore, and chasing after it is like chasing after a dream. I can't negotiate my way out of my problems. I can't ignore them. So I stopped running, and I started really soaking up my surroundings. I saw my new normal for what it was and realized that virtual life wasn't going anywhere. And then my longest stage of grief started, depression. Once I opened my eyes to my current reality, I wasn't happy. I didn't like the person I was becoming during this pandemic. I felt a strong sense of helplessness. I felt lost. Activities felt less meaningful. I had been disconnected for so long at this point. My depression eventually left me indifferent to finishing school, something that was once a cornerstone in my life. You're going to school, there's no way you're not going to school. Suddenly became an idea that was soft and malleable once the actual act of going anywhere was removed from the equation. I felt like I was losing the best parts of myself. Who am I without my friends, without school? How can I have these big dreams when I'm confined to my house, to my screen? I'm a very future-oriented person, but talking about the future and making plans had become taboo in my head. A Pandora's box I didn't touch because the future was now too uncertain for me to try to build a life around. But this next lesson I learned is one that finally brought me to an actual place of acceptance. Even though the future looks uncertain, and I felt like I could no longer control how it was going to go, I realized that the control And the precision that I thought I once had over my future had never really been there from the start. And that the future is always uncertain, no matter what we tell ourselves to the contrary. So I still need to find ways to work towards my success in a future that isn't perfectly mapped out for me. So now we've come to acceptance. The now. The Naya who's sitting here in front of you, talking to you about accepting one's circumstances and making the most of them. Acceptance takes many forms for me, and one of those forms is motivation. But now, even still, my acceptance and motivation of the situation fluctuates. Before COVID, I could always find that motivation again. If a class was interrupted by something unexpected, like an injury or issues with relationships, I would retreat back into my goals and my plans. It was a comfort, an anchor. But now, what used to be a straight line, easy to follow, where it was headed, now feels like a broken cord that I have to tape together to hold its shape. Instead of it being a linear path, it's now this little squiggly line that fluctuates and dips. It's moving upwards, yes, but not in the same way that it was before. And I've chosen to accept that. I'm accepting the fact that I'm not the same person I was when this pandemic started. I've toughened up. We've all had to. In the past few months, we've experienced a health epidemic, acts of police brutality, one of the largest civil rights movements in history, riots, and now massive wildfires that are consuming the West Coast, all while I try to keep up my grades and juggle the rest of my everyday life tasks and retain my sanity. It's an insanely high expectation for any of us to have of ourselves to go through these things and remain unaffected. I've learned that it's okay to feel scared of the future. It's okay to feel overwhelmed and sad and confused. But it's important to remember, in the midst of all of this madness, to live out the kind of life that you can be proud of. My learning and my success hasn't stopped just because I'm not on campus anymore. And that's something I have to remind myself. There's a large gap between action and inaction, a canyon filled with all of the excuses we tell ourselves to soothe our own fears. But we have to close that gap, cross that canyon, and start living life to its full potential. This pandemic has taught me so much about resilience and made me passionate about college student success. I've worked with various departments at Portland State to create a list of 20 resources that can aid students in finding greater success for themselves. Because my goal was to create a list that any college student could utilize, most of the resources aren't specific to PSU. I've had experience with a lot of the programs, so I've included insights into the application process, departments and contacts that can help you get started, and many others. This list isn't comprehensive, but it's a fantastic place to start. It's available on my LinkedIn, and you're more than welcome to connect with me while you're there. I know that we've all been through a lot, and feeling disconnected and unmotivated are perfectly reasonable responses to the reality that we're living in. But it's become clear that this is a marathon and not a sprint, and we have to find our balance again. Humans need connections. We need goals and dreams. I hope that sharing my personal story has helped you to know that you are not alone in struggling. I hope that you will find the strength to start to rebuild a life that suits you and meets your needs, even if it isn't the same one that you had to let go of. Know that I'm wishing you well.
Many thanks to our connection builders, Gio, Yoko, Robert, and Naya. Your major efforts and participation in bringing your idea worth spreading to tonight's stage means so much to our team and so much to our community. Thank you. Now, before we move into a short intermission, here is an important message from our neighbor, Third Eye Books.
My name is Michelle Lewis, and I am the co-owner of Third Eye Books, Accessories, and Gifts.
Hi, my name is Charles Hanna, co-owner of Third Eye Books, Accessories, and Gifts.
The story behind Third Eye is that I was at home with my husband. We were just, relaxing at the house, and I have a love of T-shirts, politically based T-shirts that empower and uplift Black people, and I have a love of beautiful earrings and accessories, and I love to read. And so I talked to my husband about us opening up a bookstore, and one way that we decided to do that was we supported another Black-owned business out of Atlanta called Natural Girls Rock, where I got a lot of my T-shirts, and we began to do some vending and of our books and our T-shirts. What makes us stand out is that we have a wide array of books that empower and uplift Black people and that focus on African history. We have authors like Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. Many of these authors often aren't in a lot of the mainstream media and aren't talked a lot about. So we want to make sure that we had these books accessible to people in our community where they can read them. It's really good that we get to offer books to our community that provide some education to people that have never heard of a lot of Black authors, by creating a space for Black and brown people to come and congregate and have access to books that make them feel good and that provide them some education about their African history and heritage. And so that is something that has been a dream of ours.
Different businesses are building anti-racist libraries, so it's a pleasure to help people get the books they need for their libraries and their jobs and their work and their homes.
Where we can offer space for Black and brown folk to gather and for the community to come together to connect through books. So it's just been a wonderful opportunity for us to be able to do that.
The biggest goal is to get back into a brick and mortar store. We had to close our old store down due to COVID, and they sold the building. So we're starting to launch a new fundraiser come October 1st. It's called a Third Eye Relocation Fund. That will help us give the funds to pay rent, find a new place, get a bigger selection of books and things like that. Another goal is we hope to expand our presence on social media platforms such as Instagram and Facebook. So we're on Third Eye Books or Third Eye Bag on Instagram. And also just to play a bigger part in the community, hopefully affecting the literacy rate, hopefully getting children with books to read to make them better in school. So a couple of our goals is just that, to make the community better and to make ourselves better as business people. So thanks a lot, have a good day.
Thank you so much, Third Eye Books, for sharing your story and being an important part of our community. We hope you get your brick and mortar soon. And now, welcome to our intermission featuring our guest performer, Vico. Turn up your speakers, refill your snacks, and vibe out with us. See you in about 15 minutes.
Lo que escucho yo
noche sin almohada, sentir solo mi compañía, llenar las manos de alegría, pa' luego abrir los ojos, abrirlos en otro lugar, abrirlos para celebrar el hoy.
Thank you. That was it. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you to our guest performer, Vico, and welcome back to our main session. Our next and last theme of the night is pattern recreators. We are absolutely ecstatic to introduce our one pattern recreator of tonight. This speaker began his college tenure at the age of 15, and now he's pursuing a political science degree with a minor in community development and a global studies certificate at Portland State University. He recognizes that the usage of generalizations or blanket statements are becoming increasingly prevalent, and they often dismiss any form of civil discourse, and they deconstruct an individual's uniqueness. Highlighting 3 different life scenarios that aided in redefining his worldview, we are so proud to introduce you to our last speaker of tonight, Noah Kersenhauser.
The world as we know it came to a crashing halt in late March, with the arrival of COVID-19 severely disrupting the status quo. Economies tanked, citizens grew upset, politicians struggled to save face, health officials became caught in the crossfire of politics and science, and instability undoubtedly arose. Fast forward several months to May, and we saw the death of George Floyd at the hands of a white police officer. As one might expect, this stimulated massive protests, marches, and riots. All across the nation, even around the globe, people began to protest en masse. Violence occurred, government troops became involved. Regardless of wherever your political affiliation lies, you can agree that we were and remain in a period of great instability. I myself am a 20-year-old college senior living right outside downtown Portland. During these troublesome months, I would wake up to texts from friends whose ideologies exist across the entire political spectrum. Some in unrelenting support of what was going on, others angered. I myself was more curious about the movements, the varying beliefs and driving determinants behind them. As someone driven to understand the intellectual side of things, I spent those months ruminating about how the movements arose. As I thought and did more research, I began to notice that there was a common theme echoed throughout all the sentiments expressed by each side: blanket statements. Although an oft-used phrase, what does it mean exactly? I tend to see blanket statements as statements containing generalizations. I'll provide you with a rudimentary example. I do a lot of babysitting, like a lot, and I've dealt with numerous cases of young kids vociferously informing me that they hate all vegetables, that there is no vegetable they could possibly enjoy. Now, is this a valid assertion? Of course, from the child's perspective, up until that very moment, they may have not had any positive interactions with vegetables. With this said, and although it's a valid assertion, it was easily disproven. Perhaps pulling a page out of my mother's playbook, I'd end up sneaking some type of vegetable into their lunch without them even knowing. Although a mundane example, I always found it fascinating to watch the reaction upon finding out. First horror, then visible confusion, and finally acceptance. What? This is actually pretty good. Needless to say, these blanket statements are not limited to the obstinate child unwilling to eat their vegetables. Instead, and especially in recent times, they have permeated society. They remain especially prevalent in all things political. Take, for example, the protests mentioned at the beginning of this talk. Even on this one specific topic, I myself personally have heard multitudes of blanket statements. An individual said to me that the sole reason for this current instability is the police, and that due to their very existence, this reality was inevitable from the start. Another individual said that the pure reason for the chaos confronting this country was lack of education infrastructure. Yet another said that certain groups or entities had co-opted the larger movement's goals, thus leading to lack of genuine protest and an array of opinions, similar to what occurred during the Occupy Wall Street movement, one might argue. We are thus presented with a vexing question, an interesting question. Are these statements valid? From the perspective of those who said them, they are. And this is crucial to understand. These blanket statements, generalizations, are informed by our worldview, which is in turn constructed through multiple anecdotal experiences we have as we traverse the path we all call life. Now, unfortunately, these blanket statements, these generalizations, can be severely limiting and often contribute to the cycle of instability we find ourselves in currently. So with this in mind, how do we go about understanding our usage of these blanket statements? The key, as I'll later demonstrate, is two-pronged. First, one must identify the root causes, dig deep and find those root causes about why the blanket statement is occurring. Perhaps confusion, anger, hatred. Secondly, and arguably more importantly, it's important to pursue interactions that allow you to experience different backgrounds and individuals than your own. When talking about blanket statements, these situations, I like to share 3 formative experiences that I believe help illustrate my own personal success and failure with conquering the usage of blanket statements. I love working with international youth, especially students from the Middle East. I generally work over the digital sphere, operating virtual exchange programs, but I've also done a host of in-person exchange programs as well. The students I work with come from all over the place, from Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Algeria, Yemen. As you might see, there tends to be constant messaging about the Middle East within the United States. It's a dangerous place. It's filled with terrorists. They're all Muslims there. And even sadly, in my opinion, from a teenager I met while in Chicago, they all ride camels to school. Shows the depth of these stereotypes. Growing up in this environment, with this constant messaging surrounding us, it's almost inevitable that people will grow up with skewed views about the Middle East. When I was 15 years old, I participated in my first virtual exchange program with Iraqi youth. Growing up in homogenous Portland, I had limited interaction with foreigners and those whose lived experiences differed from my own. After being inundated with constant messages from the media about life in Iraq, those living there, I'll admit, I was wary. But even more than being wary, I was curious. Curious if the blanket statements, the generalizations put forth by the media were indeed true. And if you're catching my drift by now, you'll know the answer. They were not. I interestingly found that the Iraqi teenagers I met were not all too different from myself. We all went to school, hung out with friends, spent time with our families, played games, watched sports. Now you might be wondering, Noah, how is this important to me? What does this have to do with blanket statements? The key is that these blanket statements, by transcending these blanket statements, the Iraqis would later admit that they too were nervous about communicating with the other side. We were able to tackle the real issues, the tough conversations. In this particular program, it was that of political differences, gender roles, religion. I strongly believe, to this very day, that the only reason we were able to tackle such divisive subjects is because we recognized that the generalizations put forth about our corresponding sides were dangerous and, quite frankly, patently false. I'm lucky to call many of these individuals my friends to this very day, a testament to the power of transcending blanket statements. Now, these blanket statements aren't just applied to foreigners, those living outside the United States. They even happen in our own backyard. Unfortunately, blanket statements are often attributed to members of the disability community, a reality that deeply saddens me. Arguably one of my biggest passions in life, I do considerable work within this community. I plan to adopt a child with Down syndrome one day. From teaching kids how to ride bicycles to coaching in a disability-centric basketball league, I've worked assiduously to immerse myself within this community. All the kids I work with are very different, come from different backgrounds, lived experiences, yet they have one thing in common. They're all beautiful souls, equally deserving of opportunity and equally able to prosper in this world. You'd be surprised about how many blanket statements are cast towards members of this community. They can't provide for themselves. They can't succeed in school. People with disabilities can't find passions or hobbies. They can't become productive members of society. If these statements are true, I have a multitude of examples to prove them incorrect. From the man I know who takes public transit every day to his job just like every other member of society, to one of my best friends who's like a brother to me, who was the first person with Down syndrome to graduate a 4-year university in the state of Oregon. These people are walking examples of blanket statements proved incorrect. And just like in the Middle Eastern case, I ask you this question: what good do these blanket statements actually do? If you're thinking nothing, I'm right with you. To me, they only seem to exist to categorize, to stereotype. I also like to share one final experience, a more personal experience, about when I personally succumbed to utilizing blanket statements and how astoundingly disproven I was. As stated in the beginning of this talk, blanket statements are all throughout our society. They have permeated it. COVID-19, the protests are just 2 examples out of many that have elicited these types of blanket statements. Arguably, one of the biggest issues facing in this country right now is that of political polarization. You're either a Democrat or a Republican. It has permeated the workplace, academics, even dinner tables across the nation. If you're a Democrat, you're a snowflake. If you're a Republican, you're a racist. We have lost the ability to have civil discourse in this country. From a very early age, society paints a certain picture for us depending on how and where we're raised. For the Democrat, to call a Republican a racist is a valid assertion, strengthened through constant societal messaging and an immensely isolated worldview. For the Republican, to call a Democrat a snowflake is also a valid assertion, for the same exact reason. Yet, and I feel it is important to state this explicitly, these are incredibly myopic viewpoints. They ignore everything that may make a certain individual unique. I like to share a story about how I met one of my closest friends. I grew up in a progressive household. The political literature I consumed, the news I watched, was all progressive influenced. A reality that many people, irrespective of their political opinions, also find themselves in, whether it be consciously or unconsciously. By chance, when I was participating in a basketball league, I met an individual who would later become one of my closest friends. This individual was what many would call a die-hard conservative, a die-hard Republican, votes red down the ballot. Even before getting to know him, even before hanging out with him, I had come up with ways that I thought he would think and act. He must hate immigration. He must be insensitive to racial politics. He must not be a fan of social justice. He must hate all progressives. All blanket statements, all generalizations. These were not true in the slightest. I was shocked. He is one of the most kind, caring, thoughtful, and well-spoken individuals I've had the pleasure of knowing in my 20 years on this planet. We have incredibly fruitful conversations, talk about difficult political issues. We disagree on the majority of these issues. We support different politicians, yet are able to coexist in a strong friendship. Now, how was I able to foster this relationship? Separate the person from the politics, the blanket statements. I focused on the specifics, the person who he was and the root causes he believed in, and then took the plunge and communicated with somebody whose lived experience was far different from my own. Blanket statements, generalizations have permeated our society, in politics, in academia, in the workplace, in casual conversation. It is now acceptable to make blanket statements in any situation about those with disabilities, foreigners, and especially those with different political affiliations than ourselves. These statements often go unquestioned, which leads to greater division and further instability. The key to understanding this issue, however, is that the people who make these blanket statements think them to be correct, believe them to be valid, believe them to be true. And to some extent, they are. Take, for instance, the views I held regarding my best friend. Even before hanging out with him, even before meeting him, I had come up with different ways that I thought he would think and act, which were then in turn strengthened through constant societal messaging and my own worldview. But I think personally, much of society is just content to stop there. Individuals are okay with remaining rooted in their isolated viewpoints, as it is easier than having deep and salient conversations. Yet even with this being the case, it is very possible to force oneself to stop utilizing blanket statements. The difficulty begins to occur when trying to incorporate this into your daily life. I'm sure many of you watching this talk have experienced this yourself. I continue to struggle with it. Through these experiences, however, I have noticed that one can do two important things. First, identify the root causes of why those blanket statements are occurring: confusion, hatred, anger. Secondly, force yourself, allow yourself to interact with foreign environments. And instead of casting away opposing viewpoints, seek to understand them. Find comfort in ambiguous circumstances. If an individual says all white people are racist, a blanket statement, ask them why they feel that way. If an individual says all lives matter, encourage them to flesh out their opinions on the subject. More often than not, the process of transcending blanket statements is a group effort. We can all learn from one another. By communicating with others, we are forced to recognize our own internal biases and generalizations. And even if, at the end of the day, you still believe your blanket statement to be correct, to be true, to be valid, look further, look deeper. Don't be content. So the world needs more people to be purveyors of social change, to be willing to run counter to the status quo, to be willing to force tough conversations. I'll leave you with something a professor once told me when I myself erroneously utilized a blanket statement during an office hours appointment. It only takes one individual, one entity, one thing to disprove a generalization. Thank you.
Thank you, connection builders and pattern recreators. You put these concepts on stilts. That's going to wrap up the last part of our event. We're grateful that you joined us to amplify thought leader voices and new ideas that we hope bring change to our community. We looked at the connection builders who shared their understanding of the importance of connection. We also looked at pattern recreators who shared the value of creating new ones for the betterment of ourselves and our world. Thank you to our speakers who gave their time and energy to be on this stage. Thank you to our neighbors and performers for their collaboration in this TEDx event. A big thank you to our partners, Goldendale Capital, Cairn Therapy, Fairy Tales Event Design, Kennedy Violins, and Vintage Meets Modern Events for making tonight possible. And thank you to Portland Center Stage at the Armory for opening your stage to us.
I would also just love to give a huge shout out to the TEDx community for giving your advice when needed on the TEDx Hub, and also specifically TEDx McMinnville and TEDx Bend. Thank you, Kitri and Bruce, for your kind and generous contributions for this year's event. We wouldn't have been able to make our stage just nearly as beautiful without that iconic red circle rug that we always see TED Talks being given on. And of course, the TEDx letters, which are absolutely a necessity. Thank you so much.
To the Rockstar TEDx Portland State University team, without your hard work and tenacity, this entire event would not have been possible. Thank you. And finally, thank you. Without your invaluable role, our voices and ideas wouldn't be able to spread. Again, we'd love to see your watch party set up. Please use hashtag Portland State Our Time if you're posting on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. We'll be in the same spot for part 2 next Thursday, October 29th at 4 p.m., sharing categories narrative changers and barrier breakers. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn for quick updates and key takeaways from tonight. Before we move on to our live discussion panel, here's a quick word from our neighbor, Meso.
You know, many of us came from poverty. Many of us probably are still there. But I see this on a daily basis with our staff, how hard they work to make sure that the person sitting across them in poverty goes above and beyond even themselves.
Because my dream is to have my own business. I always thinking about to have my own business. I don't want to work for somebody else for my whole life, you know.
I was working at the hospital and ended up having 2 more children. And when I was working, it was really tough because 2 of my children had spina bifida. I decided to go at home and be an at-home mom and be able to take care of them. I was missing a lot of work, and I was in a position where I couldn't miss a lot of work.
Because it's hard when you're walking into a new place and you're in need, and you don't know who you're going to get. You don't know if they're going to be nice. Are they going to look at you strange? Are they going to think that you're a failure? Are they going to be like, oh, she's not even fit for our help at all? And I didn't feel any of that. I just felt supported, and I felt like after I got done talking to her, I felt like there was hope for me. 2011, I left my job to do music, vocal coaching, and singing more on a full-time basis. But I realized that I didn't have business sense. I didn't know necessarily how to run a business.
Entrepreneurship is such an amazing tool to teach people in poverty, because there is empowerment that takes place with it. It's something you can do for yourself. It doesn't keep you in a system. It helps you move out of the system, because you're going to do something for yourself. It's almost like you're learning to fish, instead of somebody handing you a fish. And a whole village comes together to help you. And that's really, again, very visible in Portland, where there is support for local businesses. So this was our first home, and we loved it here. We loved the street, we loved the neighborhood, and we loved the support that the Black United Fund of Oregon gave us.
Saw extreme intentionality paired with the care. You saw growth in the organization, and growth meaning not necessarily staff initially, but growth in the clients that came. I think it's not just that business side and that business development where you can get so logical about here are your steps that you must do to start a business. That's there, but then it's that caring part that undergirds that. And I think for our communities that really speaks to us, because if you care about me, and if I know and I can see that you love me, there's actually more that I'm going to do. Not only that it benefits me, but I'm going to allow this person to hold me accountable.
I feel that my job is to hold their dreams till I can help them come true, make them come true, and then let them fly with it.
Thank you so much, Meso. The impact you have on our community is so invaluable. We will now conclude tonight's event and move into a 30-minute live panel discussion with all of the speakers we just heard from, connection builders and pattern creators, where you'll be able to ask questions or just listen. Please don't feel obligated to turn on your webcam. You can find the Zoom meeting link at the bottom of the YouTube Live description below. When posting photos, please use hashtag #PortlandStateOurTime. If you're having any technical difficulties, please feel free to post your questions in the YouTube Live chat feature, and one of our team members will assist you. Thank you again so much for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you soon.
Se ha quedado tras la nube que opacaba el resplandor. Se ha esfumado ya la duda. Nadie ha visto lo que he visto yo. Se ha quedado angustia se